Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar organised by Trotman, but I'm broadcasting to you from a wet and windy South Cambridgeshire. This particular webinar is on Gatsby Benchmark 4, and we've titled it Planning Careers Education in the Curriculum. Hopefully you can follow my presentation on the screen. This is the fifth in a series of 8 webinars being led by Tristram Hooley and myself. We're the 2 authors of the Careers Leader Handbook, which was published by Trotman and released at the end of September. And as I say, this is the 5th of webinar in the series of 8. The first one focused on an overview and an introduction to careers leadership. And then the next 7 are based on each of the Gatsby benchmarks. But the alert amongst you will realize there are 8 benchmarks and those 7 webinars. So what we're doing for the next webinar, which is this time next week, we're combining 2 of the benchmarks, benchmarks 5 and 6, which are to do with work with employers, whether it's within the school or college or within the workplace. But this particular one, as I say, focuses on benchmark 4 and around careers education in the curriculum. But what we're doing in these seminars is following the structure of section 2 of the handbook, which is the biggest section of the handbook, and it takes each of the benchmarks in turn. I say all of that by way of introduction because I want to make clear at the beginning, some of you will have heard some of the previous webinars that Tristram led. It so happened with the commitments, the way it's worked is he's done the first 4 and I'm doing the second 4. So some of you will have participated in some of those, but others of you, this might be the first webinar. So I'm going to deliver it as a standalone webinar, which will mean that those of you who have been part of this series before, there'll be a bit of overlap about some of the introductory remarks and some of the stuff at the end. But I'll just ask you to be a bit forbearing about all of that because there will be some people for whom this is their first time into this webinar. And my plan is to speak, present for probably about 20 minutes or so, and then leave time at the end to probably 10-15 minutes to respond to your questions, which you can submit by typing on the panel that you should be able to see. Okay, so this particular webinar, as I say, focuses on one of the chapters in section 2 of the handbook, chapter 4 or 2.4, which is focusing on careers education. And this slide shows what I'm going to cover in these 20 minutes. There's a bit of introduction to the Gatsby benchmarks, which will be familiar territory to you, probably most of you, either because you've been a part of a previous webinar or you've heard it at other conferences and events and workshops over the last 4 years, if you're working in England. I'll say something in particular about benchmark 4, because if any element of our handbook is to any extent controversial and maybe deviates slightly away from the Gatsby line, it's this one. So I'll say a bit more about that. And then very specifically, I'll talk about what do we mean by careers education? How do you go about designing a scheme of work? A crucial issue about how do you decide where it fits into the curriculum and who teaches it? And then finally, a focus on linking other subject teaching course programs in schools and colleges to careers. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to start by this overview of Gatsby. As I say, this will be familiar territory to most of you, but I can't make that assumption. It will be familiar to everyone listening, particularly as I noticed on the list of attendees, there are some people listening in from outside of the UK, such as the wonder of webinars. Where do the Gatsby benchmarks come from? They come from a piece of research funded by the Gatsby Foundation. The Gatsby Foundation is the charitable foundation of Lord Sainsbury. Lord Sainsbury was a minister. He's particularly interested in science and science education, and therefore particularly interested in the so-called STEM related careers and encouraging young men and young women to enter into careers based on science, technology, engineering and maths. So he's particularly interested in the guidance that young people get. The work was led by Sir John Holman, or to give him his full title, Professor Sir John Holman, who's a retired professor of chemistry, but at the York University, but his background is science teaching. He was a head of science in a school and a head teacher in a school. And he got very interested in what does good career guidance look like at a time when it's fair to say that there was a dismantling of a lot of the provision that was had previously been available in England. And there's a lot of talk at conferences about the poor state and the patchy nature of career guidance across the country in our schools. And John took the view, well, let's stop talking about it being poor and patchy and let's do something about it. And so let's define what it looks like when it's good. And he led a team supported by Tristram and others from the International Centre for Guidance Studies at Derby, looked at best practice in this country and abroad and identified these 8 benchmarks of good practice and presented them in a report that was published now 4.5 years ago, April 2014. And these have now been adopted by the UK government and promoted heavily in England as a framework for schools to base and colleges to base their careers provision for young people. So that's the background to the benchmarks. For many of us, I think one of the good features, many good features of the benchmarks is that they are as one careers leader summed up when she met the minister in charge of careers, actually the previous minister, Robert Halfon, when he visited one of the Gatsby pilot schools up in the northeast. And his observation was, well, these are common sense. And her reply was, yes, Minister, common sense, but not necessarily common practice. The great advantage of these benchmarks is that they're not tied up with lots of educational jargon. They are very readily understood by people who it's important that they are understood by people outside of the careers profession, senior leaders, governors in schools and colleges, policymakers, and we can now articulate in fairly clear terms what we mean is good practice, and we can do something about implementing it into practice. So if we look at those 8 benchmarks, I'm not going to read them all out. They're there on the slides. These slides will be made available after this webinar, but I've highlighted the 2 where careers education features. We've linked it in the book to chapter 4 and the 4th benchmark. And the 4th benchmark is in shorthand, linking curriculum learning to careers. So the idea here is that in subject areas in schools, course programs in colleges, we take every opportunity to link the learning in that subject area, in that course program area, to careers and future opportunities. It also features implicitly in the overarching benchmark, benchmark 1, which talks about a stable and embedded program of career education and guidance. Now, I did say this is where we differ in our line, Tristram and I differ in our line from the line that's taken by Gatsby, is that what isn't explicit in the benchmarks, and we're both great supporters of the benchmarks, but there are areas where we think there could be further attention, and one of them is making more explicit the need for discrete career education alongside that career education that features within subject programs and course programs. The starting point for the recent period of history of careers work in schools and colleges in England was the removal of the external career guidance service, the Connection Service, and passing on responsibility for career guidance over to individual schools and colleges. And at the same time, the government removed the requirement on schools to provide a planned program of career education. And we think that was a great mistake. And one of the things that we push in this chapter in particular is the need for career education and how to go about planning a program of career education. So we'd be really supportive of the fact that it should be part of a stable and embedded careers program. We're really supportive of the idea that we should be taking opportunities to integrate careers work into subject learning course programs, but we also think it's very important that there is some discrete provision of career education for 2 reasons really. One, to deliver those parts of career education that don't readily sit within subject programs. And secondly, as a means of pulling together all of those cross-curricular elements to make sense for the young people. So a lot of the focus of this chapter is on planning discrete elements of career education within the curriculum. Towards the end, and I will mirror that in this webinar, towards the end, we do make reference to and pay some attention to linking careers work into subject areas. So that's the position of careers education and the benchmarks. If we look particularly at benchmark 4, and those of you who are working in schools and colleges in England will be familiar with the statutory guidance that is published for schools and the guidance that is published for colleges. Both of those documents have been recently updated. If you've got January and February 2018 versions, you've got an out-of-date version because new versions were published last month in October, and you can find those on the Gov UK website. And I've extracted from there on this particular slide what it says from the Gatsby benchmarks in terms of benchmark 4. So in the schools version, we get an expectation that all teachers should link curriculum learning to careers, as I've said. And the particular example that's used to illustrate this is STEM subjects. And then when it then specifies what that might look like, there is the statement that by the age of 14, every pupil should have the opportunity to learn how the different STEM subjects help people gain entry to and be more effective workers within a wide range of careers. And then if we look at that from the college guidance, similar point is made, is that all subject staff should link their curriculum learning to careers, even if those courses are not occupationally led. And the example again given is STEM related careers. And I think the line that we would take on this is that all of that is right, but why is it only just STEM subjects? Shouldn't this happen in all subjects? Shouldn't PE, shouldn't modern languages, shouldn't arts, shouldn't music take opportunities to help young people see how some of the knowledge and understanding and skills developed in that subject is applied in the world of work, but also what are some of the progression opportunities from those subjects in terms of further study and work areas. So we think that, yes, we should be promoting STEM related careers, but we should also be taking opportunities to link all subject areas to it. And that's an issue that we'll pick up again at the end of this webinar, and we pick up at the end of that chapter. And that's why I've made a point at the bottom here of highlighting benchmark 1, which is written exactly the same for schools and colleges, that every school and college should have an embedded program, and this is my underlining, of career education and guidance that is known and understood by everybody. So stressing there the importance of career education alongside career guidance. So if we now look specifically at career education and the help that we try and give careers leaders in the handbook, first of all, let's look at, so what is it? What do we mean by it? And I think this is a fairly tried and tested definition of what career education is. Older readers might be familiar with the DOTS analysis, DOTS framework that's been around for about 40 years, designed by Tony Watts and Bill Law, and it's reflected in this particular aim and purpose, which still stands the test of time and works for today. Essentially what careers education is about is helping students develop the knowledge and skills they need to be able to make realistic and informed choices about their futures in learning and work. So that's where the S, the O, and the D come in DOTS. It's decisions, choices, opportunities, informed about what's available, realistic understanding of yourself. And then the T, which is also equipping them with the knowledge and skills to manage those transitions to the next phase. How do I find opportunities? How do I apply for them successfully? And then lastly, and what's it going to be like when I get there so I succeed, whether that's in further education, in higher education, in training, or in work. And we can sum that up by saying it's a set of skills and knowledge. The skills are often expressed these days in these terms. particular emphasis being on career management skills, the skills to seek opportunities, well, for research them in the first place and identify what might be right for you, and then to seek those opportunities and be successful in gaining those opportunities. There's a lot of talk about employability skills, those skills that you need to be successful in any job, sometimes inappropriately, I think, called the soft skills. But we've added to that list, particularly some work that comes from some research that Tristram did a few years ago within his work at Derby when he was Professor of Education there, Professor of Career Education there. The notion of digital career competencies. So much job search and applications and networking to find opportunities is done online these days. So a set of skills that young people need in order to be able to cope and use successfully digital means, online, social media, etc., in terms of their career planning and development. So added along to their career management skills, we talk about their digital career competencies. And then an issue that is of concern for me is that, yes, it's very important that young people have employability skills, but actually, if you look at what's happened over the last generation or so, we have delayed entry into the labour market for young people. Nobody can go into the labour market now until 18. Everybody has to remain in some form of learning to age 18. And because of the rise in the number of people going into higher education, many young people that we're working with in schools and colleges won't be entering the labour market until their early 20s. That's when they'll need their employability skills. But what they'll need before then is a set of independent learning skills, the skills to succeed in learning in college, in training programs, apprenticeships, and universities. And we know that one of the biggest reasons for HE dropout is their inability to cope with independent learning. So I've added that to the list. And then alongside the skills comes the knowledge and understanding of work, of learning options, and of career, to know how you're going to apply those skills. Bill Law often used to talk about career education that happens in schools and colleges is not always career education, it's more career training, training people with a set of skills to get a career and cope with it and succeed in it. And he would also want to see alongside it some career education to help understand what a career is these days in terms of future options in learning and work and how your career might be lived. So that's what it is. When we get on to designing a scheme of work, what we've put in the handbook is, again, something that will be familiar to many people, I'm sure, is a 7-stage cycle of planning. And what the book does is take the user, the reader, through this process of identifying what it is that students have done already, what it is in broad terms they need to learn, defining the aims and objectives and outcomes for that area of the curriculum, planning activities in terms of what content and how to deliver them, and thinking about how you assess what they've learned so that you can plan the next stage, and then keeping the program under continuous review and evaluation and continuing to develop it in futures. We then talk about where this should be delivered in the curriculum and who should teach it. Now, a careers leader doesn't determine those factors. That's determined by senior leaders who are in charge of curriculum and timetable. But we're of the view that it's a careers leader's responsibility to make proposals to those curriculum managers about what model should be adopted and who should be teaching it. And that's, we see, as one of the illustrations. What's the difference between a careers coordinator and a careers leader? A careers leader is a subject leader, and subject leaders take responsibility for their area, plan the scheme of work, and then manage their senior leaders in the sense of putting proposals to them. Now, you may not get what you ask for, but you should at least ask for it. So that's why we put in a section there about what are the pros and cons of different models of delivery. So helping you decide how best it should be delivered in your school or college, because you can spend ages putting a really good scheme of work together, but it will stand or fall by who's teaching it and how effective they are and whether it's in the right place in the curriculum. So in this section, we discuss the models that exist in schools, pre and post, pre-16 in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, and sometimes schools will have different models in different years. There are a few schools, very few and far between these days, mostly special schools, that offer discrete careers lessons. More likely it's a module within a carousel of PSHE modules. The problem with that is, although it's taught by the specialist, it's sometimes for some youngsters too early in the year and sometimes too late in the cycle. The Ofsted evidence shows us that the most effective model is an integrated PSHE course where all of the elements of personal, social, health and economic education, including careers education, are integrated into a coherent whole with everything happening at the right time, but taught by a dedicated team of committed PSHE teachers who are confident with the program. That's different from a tutorial program, which is the same idea of linking it all into a single integrated program, but taught by every tutor. And what we know then is that often some young people don't get the best of experiences. Some schools in particular offer a drop-down day approach. Our view there is these are very good ways of enhancing a careers program, but they are weak if it's the only model of delivery, if your careers only happens on one day in the school year. And then, and this comes back to the point I raised earlier about links to subject teaching, a cross-curricular approach. We think that reinforces discrete elements, but shouldn't be relied on as a sole model for the reasons I talked about earlier. Post-16, different set of models because the curriculum structure is different in colleges and school sixth forms. Tutorial programs are often more effective post-16 than they are pre-16. Sixth form tutors tend to take it as their responsibility. There are other approaches, the separate timetabled course, the series of events, and where you're doing a vocational program in particular, it's possible to integrate the careers education into that program. And what we do in the book is discuss the pros and cons of each of those. This is just a quick overview of the chapter, so I'm going to conclude with looking at what are the extra resources that we highlight in the chapter. So this is a feature of all the chapters. Where there are additional resources available, we signpost the reader to those, usually with the web link where it's available. So there's the Careers and Enterprise Company's publication about what works in terms of careers education in the curriculum. There's the Career Development Institute, the professional bodies framework. One of the hardest parts of this cycle is stage 3, defining your aims and objectives for a program. That framework helps with that by giving some suggested outcomes as a starting point. There are only 2 ways of coming up with a list of outcomes. One is to write it, a blank sheet of paper. That's hard work. The other is to borrow somebody else's and adapt it, and that's what the framework does. There are free resources available. For example, Barclays Life Skills Program, freely available careers education resources. Then there are other resources. Many of you might be familiar with the Prospects Education Resources website, which is a one-stop shop for all careers publishers. And some people are interested in accreditation schemes for their careers education programs, and we signpost people to those. Alongside, this is something that people who've signed into previous webinars will be familiar with. Alongside the book, Trotman has generously put up a freely available companion website to the book where you can download additional resources. And within that, we've designed a number of tools, planning and review pro forma, that you might find quite useful. So in relation to this particular chapter, you can find a lesson plan template, because one of the features of careers leaders that we've learnt over recent years is that not all careers leaders are teachers and therefore not always familiar with curriculum planning. So we've provided lesson plan templates. We've planned a tool for monitoring the quality of your careers education lessons based on the Ofsted criteria for outstanding lessons. And we've also provided a tool to help you review your current models of delivery and considering any changes that you might want to make there. And all those tools are available in PDF and Word formats for you to use, whether you use them online or download them and print them. Just come back to this issue of linking subject teaching. Lastly, we do talk about that at the end of the chapter. We do think it's important, alongside the discrete element of careers education that I've just been through, that all subject areas should help students understand how what happens in the classroom links to the wider workplace. That we're not saying that should happen every lesson, not necessarily every week, but we should take opportunities to help young people link curriculum learning to careers, as the benchmark says. We also think it's a responsibility of all subject areas and course programs to help young people understand the progression routes in terms of future study options and work options. And then it may be that the discrete provision is also supplemented by some particular planned activities in particular subjects. And we've given there 3 examples that we've seen most commonly. For example, perhaps the English department might take on the work of helping students to write a targeted CV linked to their objectives of helping students write for a particular audience. Humanities might look at changes in the local economy over time, and those important management skills might be taken up in IT lessons. And then the point that I also mentioned earlier about independent learning, we think that's a responsibility of all subjects to help students not only learn, but learn how to learn. So that in summary is what we say in chapter 2.4. That's the handbook. I'll just say these concluding remarks because some people might want to sign off and not be there for the question bit. So I'll just make these concluding remarks and give parish notices about the next webinar. That's the book. That's where you order it from Trotman's if you've yet to get your copy. Alongside the companion website, Trotman is also making available a number of resources for careers leaders. That may be how some of you found out about these webinars. There's other resources available there. The next webinar, as I mentioned earlier, is this time next week on Wednesday, when we'll be looking at benchmarks 5 and 6, the 2 that are working with employers, and you know how to sign up because you've got onto this one. You might also be interested in this. It's a bit short notice now, but Tristram and I are running a 1-day workshop on the book. We're doing that twice. We're doing it in London next Thursday, and we're doing it in York on Tuesday week. We've got a viable number of bookings for each, but there are places still available. You can get the booking form from that link, which is Tristram's blog, Adventures in Career Development, or the last slide of this webinar has got my website address on it, and if you go to the courses page of that website, you can get the booking form from there. There's a number of references to books that we've guides that we've mentioned in the chapter. So obviously there's the full reference for the handbook. There's the Gatsby guide that I've talked about at the beginning, and something that's fundamental to the structure of the handbook is the guidance that's come from the Careers and Enterprise Company on understanding the role of careers leader. There's a schools version of that to publication and a colleges one. Tristram covered those in the first webinar. So if you weren't at that first webinar, you can download the slides of that webinar. So in summary, benchmark 4 is about your role as a subject leader for careers education. Key headlines are planning schemes of work, working with your senior leader to decide where it's best delivered, then supporting those staff who are going to be delivering it, monitoring what they've done, are they delivering what you planned, and keeping it under review, and then working with subject and course leaders to help them integrate careers work into their schemes of work and programs. So that's it. I'm probably nearer the 30 minutes than the 20 minutes, but my little panel at the side tells me that most of you have hung on in there. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been of some help. If you haven't bought the book, buy a copy. If you'd like to get in touch with me about anything, then that's my email address and website. And I maybe speak to you next week. I'm now going to look at the questions, and I can't see that there are any questions. There's a very nice thank you from somebody. Thank you. So if there are no questions, oh, hang on. Working in a sixth form college. Interesting. We're planning to have a teacher, course leader or careers enthusiast who is a point of contact in each course department to drive and facilitate careers within the curriculum. Have you heard of case studies around innovates of this in practice? Good question. And yes, I have. That's what some of the schools in the Gatsby pilot are doing, and I've picked it up in other areas as well. And it's not always, in fact, it's rarely the head of department. The head of department's got enough to do. So each department is asked to identify a member of staff who will be a link with careers. And some places call that a careers champion. And the careers leader then gets together with those people, either on a bilateral basis, one-to-one, and helps them, or as a meeting as a whole group, and plans activities that help them think about how they might include careers information, careers education within their programs. So, yeah, it's emerging practice. What we know from the various bits of research there's been in the last 4 years since the benchmarks were published, benchmark 4 is the hardest one for schools to achieve, as it's written in the benchmark, i.e. this link to subjects, because it is about engaging with all subject areas. But one way to do it is, as you've suggested there, identify a member of staff in each department with whom you can work. Worth meeting them as a group, but also worth picking them off one at a time, starting with a friend and then spreading out from there. I think that's it for questions now. So if anybody does want to follow anything up, you've got my email address there. But I'll sign off now. Wish you well, and maybe speak to some of you next Wednesday.